Well, prep time's over. Can I just check that all teams are here? And also, if all teams consent to being streamed. OG,
We're
you
here and we
can
can.
consent to both. Wonderful. Oh,
Yeah, we're here.
do you mind being streamed?
We said in the chat.
Oh, I can't read and think at the same time. Sorry. Need to have all of these things verbally confirmed. CG.
First speaker is here. Second speaker is on his way. I think his Wi-Fi is a little bit finicky.
The streaming thing. You're good?
Yeah.
Cool. CO. Closing up. I can see
Hello,
that you're
yeah,
here.
good with streaming.
Wonderful. Cool. Welcome to round 2 of Astana Open 2023. My name is Alex. I'll be your chair for this round. My preferred pronouns are she or her. However, I would prefer if you address the panel as a whole using non-gendered language. If my panelists would like to introduce themselves in the order in which they appear on tab.
Hello everyone, I am Esther and I'm going to be a judge in this round. Wishing you best.
Hi everyone, Sahej here. I'll be a panelist for this round. Preferred pronouns are he, him. All the best.
Cool. If we could go through teams and get your speaking order and any introduction you wish to give, starting with OG.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'll be speaking first. I use he, him. Best of luck, all.
Hey, I'm Tejas speaking second. Here they works. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, OO.
Oh yeah, hi, my name is Haeseong. I'll be LO.
Hi, Youngwoo, DLO. Yeah, no preferred pronoun.
Thank you, CG.
I'm Rehan, he, him, speaking first.
Ziyad, he, they, speaking second. Am I audible like this?
Yep. CO.
Hello, I'm Anshuman speaking first, Arnav speaking second, he, him for both. Yeah, HPY is in the chat.
Wonderful. A few things before we get started. Firstly, I'm not going to be putting timestamps in the chat. You are all old enough to time yourselves and others. Secondly, please try and offer and accept POIs are very important. If you have a POI preference, please state it before you start your speech. If a speaker states a preference, please try and follow that preference. It's polite. Thirdly, you have a minute from when you're called upon to start your speech. If you do not start within that minute, I will just start a timer. I will inform you before I do this, but those be the rules. With all of that being said, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start. I forgot to speak. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the debate.
Awesome. Just confirming, is like all the streaming stuff good to go?
Camilla? Could someone from Allcom confirm, please? Hello? Two seconds, I'll message more Allcom.
Well, I can actually see the room streaming on the Facebook page, so seems like it's happening.
That was a sensible way to resolve that question. Cool, thank you, Warren. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. That is a smart check. Fantastic. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Just feel free to pop them in there. I'll take one from probably CO, around 5 or so. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's break the ivory tower. 3 pieces of framing and setup. First, what do we support at opening government? 1, we support academics engaging with social issues like historians researching great historical figures like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk with relevance to political discourse, or social scientists prioritizing research into the causes and public policy responses to present issues like homelessness or poverty, or biologists focusing more time on cutting-edge research into sickle cell anemia as opposed to abstract research into the human anatomy. Second, we support academic actively engaging with organizers, with people on the ground, with local communities, conducting outreach programs to determine how they can maximize their social relevance as opposed to maximizing their publication numbers in academic journals. Finally, we support tying academic incentives to real-world impact. For example, quantifying the metric of social impact that an author or their research has, and then tethering that to promotion, to compensation, to tenure, and so forth. By contrast, opposition defends the pursuit of scholarship for scholarship's sake. In some cases, there is overlap between social relevance and academic relevance. In the large bulk of cases, it is necessary to prioritize focus on social issues to redirect the incentives of academics to ensure they actually promote real-world good. Second piece of framing. What does academia look like on either side of the house? This is often a highly insular field whereby you need to be relatively privileged and well-connected to get a job in academia. You often had to have attended years upon years of schools. That often accompanies a huge amount of cost and a large opportunity cost, which means wealthy individuals are those most able to engage in academia. And in many cases, the people who become professors or have large positions of influence, like within departments or boards or deans in university, are relatively old and often tenured. This is important because in order to correct for the subconscious biases of these individuals, you need active outreach incentives to work on the ground with people who look different from you to ensure that you are not simply publishing for the ivory tower's sake, but engaging with real-world issues. Third and finally, there are strong pressures on either side of the house, irrespective of what the general focus of academia is, for scholars to pursue scholarship and to pursue the pursuit of intellectual truth. The reason is that academics were often trained with a strong focus on scholarship. Their years in grad school and their postdoc era often led them to care deeply about knowledge for knowledge's sake, and they care deeply about their reputation academically within academic circles. This is important because it establishes that academics on either side of the house have strong personal incentives to ensure they still pursue the pursuit of intellectual truth. On open government, we provide a valuable counterbalancing force which ensures that university faculty balance those academic interests against the real necessity to improve conditions on the ground. Three arguments then from opening government. First, on the advancement of pro-social aims. Second, on why this is better for academia. And lastly, on the moral duties of the institutions. First argument on the advancement of pro-social aims. Academia is powerful because universities concentrate brilliant scholars, collective expertise, and technical facilities, which means that universities are unusually well positioned to advance knowledge and produce meaningful publications with an ability to affect real-world change. That change is good on our side of the house in at least three ways. The first is that when academics ensure their work is socially relevant, there are immediate benefits to people on the ground. When, for example, university medical institutions focus more time developing local cures for issues plaguing local communities, people on the ground immediately benefit from access to improved medical technology. When social scientists focus more of their time researching present-day issues as opposed to abstract issues, like, for example, how people lived their lives in the 1700s or 1800s, there is an immediate reaffirmation of the discrimination minorities on the ground face. This is important because universities are often built in relatively insular and wealthy areas in urban megacities like Mumbai. It's on our side of the house that benefits accrue to a wider audience. Secondly, social movements benefit on our side of the house. Why is that? When academics actively involve themselves in the movement of social activism, they provide credentialist support to these movements. When there is, for example, an academic publicly attending rallies or speaking on behalf of the movement, upper middle class voters, who are often the crucial swing demographic needed to affect political change, are more likely to view those movements as credible and having experts on their side. Furthermore, when academics focus more time on relevant social issues, it provides tangible policy platforms for movements to campaign on, specific ways, for example, to stop gentrification or ways to decrease rates of homelessness in San Francisco. That means that there is tangible evidence social movements can point to in the pursuit of political change, hence increasing their ability to bargain for change and create meaningful benefits. The potential opposition pushback is that academics have poor incentives when it comes to the sort of socially relevant work that they do. That is unlikely given the new connections formed between academics and people on the ground, that there are now social ties between university deans and local activists, local communities, and the universities they represent it in. That means that Yale professors now actively work with people on the ground in New Haven, as opposed to primarily spending their time in academic circles at conferences, which means that we're likely to correct for those biases. Finally, we improve public policy on our side of the house. Why is that? There is often a lack of private sector research into important public policy issues, like, for example, how you promote economic development in rural poor areas, or, for example, how you can improve access to healthcare in particularly displaced regions. Importantly, that is because there is an insufficient private profit incentive for the private sector to fulfill that type of research, which means it is necessary for academics to fill the void. Public policy research then informs government policy. It provides you with better information on how to construct redistributive tax systems. How do you promote the aggregate quality of life for real people on the ground, for example, by improving welfare schemes and the distribution of aid a la Bolsa Familia in Brazil, being backed up by major institutions in that country. That means on our side of the house, research does more good for real people on the ground. Before I talk about academia, Sia.
If society currently believes that sun revolves around the earth, do you think anyone on your side would try to prove that wrong?
The example is really odd. I don't think that's a huge concern. But more importantly, our claim is that you get more support for academia. Why is that? At present, when universities focus first and foremost on academic truth, there is a lack of trust and hence limited funding for universities because very few people care about academic ivory tower concerns. And the more and more that universities focus on ivory tower academic issues, the more disengaged they become from important societal debates, for example, around systemic racism within the police force. It is on our side of the house that universities perceive and are covered in the media as more relevant to the public's interest. And governments become more dependent on universities on our side of the house when their public policy decisions are actively being formed by university faculty as opposed to by private sector researchers who are often funded by worse means a la corporations. That means there is increased political support for academia on our side of the house. It is more relevant and governments grow more reliant on universities. Hence, this argument is most important because any benefit flowing from universities is contingent on political support and funding and institutional backing for these universities. But furthermore, it's on our side of the house that we actively increase student engagement and buy-in within university programs. High rates of dropout in universities are often in part caused because students do not feel like what they are learning in the classroom is relevant or matters. It is on our side of the house that the work of universities is more aligned with state interests. That's not just a principled good, given that universities receive state support. It also increases engagement in the classroom. We propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and invite the Leader of Opposition to start the case for OO.
Okay, am I audible?
You are.
Okay, so I'd like to take QI probably from CG if they have one at about 5-minute mark. I'll
to time their speeches and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for OG.
Hi, can you hear me?
You're clearly audible.
Lovely. POIs in the chat exclusively, please. Two points in my speech. First, how this affects academia, and second, the social impact of research. First, on how this affects academia, I want to first address Elo's claim that funding decreases from corporations and governments when it's less about filling existing gaps within academia. First, on the governance point, I actually think funding substantially increases from governance on our side. Why? Because governments are driven by political capital. They need public justification and public pressure in order to spend limited state budgets, especially in developing countries, on academic research. When academia is broadly perceived as an ivory tower, there is no reason to fund this. No one in the US has heard of Judith Butler or knows the research they do. However, a JPAL office in Tamil Nadu built upon MIT or associated with IIT working on PMAY, which is the Housing Accessibility Scheme from the national government, or setting up the Domestic Violence Helpline, means people have heard of an organization like JPAL or the university that it's affiliated with within India. And so the government is able to say, look, we funded JPAL, that's a good thing. That builds political capital in order to fund academia. The second point, though, is individual donors are more interested on our side. Academia relies on people like university alumni, but they have a bunch of other things to care about in deciding what to fund. And there is a whole host of funding that isn't just alumni of elite universities, like academic institutions in smaller universities with less wealthy alumni. They are more likely to get funding from people like philanthropists, as well as multimillionaires who are interested in the fact that academia is doing socially relevant work if they read about it in a newspaper or it becomes within their realm of influence. We concede, though, that maybe this means at the margin, corporate funding goes down. But corporate funding is usually not funding for original research. The reason why is corporations can just fund research within companies themselves. Rather, they fund academia in order to bolster their own credibility, often by funding research whose conclusions are predetermined, like the sugar lobby funding academics. But academics don't have a source of funding in the government. The implication of that is academics' alternative sources of funding, if they are not doing impact-driven research, often end in them doing harm, like doing bad or p-hack research that says sugar isn't that bad for you, that misleads the public en masse. I want to quickly explain our argument on public trust in academia. The problem right now is academia is perceived as an isolated ivory tower. This changes on our side, both the type of research that's being done, as well as the fact that academia now has an incentive to interact with the general public. So even if academics are privileged on both sides, they still have to do things like run call centers or run programs on the ground, interview people and run surveys on the ground, be part of teams that are literally meeting people and interacting with them. All of that does substantial amounts to bridge the gap in trust that currently exists. This is important because it ensures funding goes there and it ensures academics join. Why does this argument kill opening opposition as well as other teams in this debate? The first is any research, including research about whether the Earth revolves around the sun, depends on having academic funding to begin with. So if we get that, we are prior to those claims. But second, remember Ryan's framing. Academics are interested in closing gaps within academia on both sides. Granted, they do less of it on our side, but they still have some interest. Both because, one, this is a selection effect for who becomes an academic. People become academics because they are interested in the field and have noticed gaps, and those gaps bother them. But also this gains respect and trust from older professors who often see these gaps in the field as important. So, for example, you have Lisa Piccirillo in MIT solving the Conway knot problem in her spare time, even if it's not the primary focus of her research. So we still get some of that. The critical margin is we have more academics and more funding. So even that type of research ends up happening better on our side than their side, even if academics, the ratio of time that they spend on this research reduces. I want to then address the claim that, potentially, this research happens anyway, governments care about this anyway, why do you need academia? And that brings me to my second point of clash on how this affects society broadly. 4 reasons academia is unique in this respect. One, because people would much rather work in universities than research for a government. Universities offer tenure. They offer prestige in society that give you access to things like corporate connections for you to get a job. Second, research within government is often highly politically motivated and dependent on the whims of the party in power, meaning funding and support for it often heavily fluctuates and changes over time. Third, academia has unique and already established systems of research accountability. Like governments, you just get a salary, whereas in academia, you care about getting published, meaning you have to go through peer review and ensure your research is legit and you have it evaluated by other academics. Fourth, because universities have more funding, because they have both state funding and private funding, so you have more capacity to do research. Now I want to address opposition's claim that doing basic academic research ends up affecting the rest of society. We expand the scope of knowledge, any potential claims from CO that basic research is good for society broadly. One, academics are poor arbiters of what's good for society. They are relatively privileged and their experiences are pretty isolated. So what the field researches is rarely actually have second order impacts for society. Now, Opp might say, well, isn't that true on your side? Why would academics do a good job on your side? A couple of reasons. One, because you can literally measure it. Universities have incentives to do things like quantify research, like medical research on the basis of qualities that are produced. Before I get to my other reasons, closing.
Don't you think there will be more challenge from social groups towards academia at the point when they are doing commentary on society?
Yeah, so I think social groups challenging academia is less likely, but even if they're commentating on society, they are doing it obviously in a way that's sympathetic and strategic. So they are interacting with social groups on the ground. They are talking to them and understanding what their problems are. Furthermore, a lot of ivory tower academics on your side still get somewhat involved in social issues, but they do it with much less knowledge. So you have academics weighing in on social issues despite having research that doesn't focus on those issues, causing the types of backlash that you're describing. Okay, why are academics good arbiters? One, because you can quantify social impact quite literally. They say this is just about majority issues. First, the majority is better than the top 1%, which is what academics usually are. The majority of people are poor, they need malaria, that sort of thing. But furthermore, you can literally quantify the types of change that is happening. The second reason is you can work on the ground. So JPAL and SIGA conduct randomized controlled trials by literally working in villages in Punjab, or they set up organizations like Give Directly that give cash transfers in Uganda and Rwanda. Third, this changes the composition on who becomes an academic, flipping their claim on social mobility. So you have Dalits like Suraj Yengde and Chandraban Prasad having their work actually seen as relevant because they are interested in social impact, which also beats their claim on a focus on STEM, because humanities work is perceived as abstract and not advancing critical questions unless you perceive it as directly tied to the problems that people face on the ground. For these reasons, and because we get academic funding, propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opp to continue the case for OO.
POIs audibly, please. My Zoom chat doesn't work. Also, Ziyad, don't text me during the speech. Okay. Academia does more than research, and academic relevance has to do with, and social relevance has to do with more than research. The crux of our case is that by focusing on social relevance, you do more things like outreach, which means you can support more students and do things that are actually useful to the student body and to people around the community of this university. First, framing out the research stuff from top half, I think the private sector is going to do this sort of research that both teams talked about anyway, and it's better to leave these research gaps to be filled by them because they have more capacity to do the research, because they have profit incentives, which means it is easier to get enough money to fund the sorts of research that does the social stuff and that does the academic stuff. And the private sector has like incentives to do that social research that OO talked about as well, and humanities research that OO talked about, because those types of fields and fields like gender studies are actually being like really big and profitable as well. People want the data from those sorts of researchers, or like, and big companies want the data from those sorts of researchers. Like social media companies want to know about like the latest developments in gender studies. And second, because they have access to economies of scale, that is, they have access to better research facilities in the private sectors with multiple people researching the same things, whereas universities, we oftentimes only have one specialist in each different field, which means you have fewer peers to help you do that research. And they also have the incentive to plug the research gaps because they can make money from doing that. This means that Gov stuff about socially beneficial research happens anyway. It means that Opp stuff about universities doing research, unique research about humanities, also is framed out because that sort of research would happen in the private sector anyway. So we probably shouldn't care about research when you're adjudicating this round. What you should care about then is the social relevance of, or the benefits that occur outside of the research field within academia, because academia is more than just research. Universities do a lot more than that. OG made had a problem by focusing, by narrowing the debate to only focus on the academic research of the motion. But according to the motion clarifications, academic relevance seeks to close gaps within within the field of academia, and closing research gaps sounds a lot like their whole case about closing gaps in social sciences research. And also in the motion clarification, we saw that within the debate whether academia can pursue other social relevance through other means. The claim from CG then is that social relevance is likely going to look like doing things like social outreach, and it's likely going to look more like that than like OG's claim about plugging gaps in academia, plugging different gaps in academia. Outreach looks like outreach programs in the community of the university. It looks like advertising programs of the university. It looks like investing in things like dorms and things that improve student welfare within your college. And it looks like investing more in humanities departments and investing more in other departments and in the teaching of the university as opposed to the research of the university. Why is this a more likely interpretation of the motion than what we heard about from OG? The motion itself has nothing to do with research. It says academia. And I think that the average informed voter probably associates the social relevance of academia a lot more with learning in universities than they do with research in universities. First, because universities are just associated with learning than research. Like if you think of Harvard, you don't think of someone doing research in a lab. You think of a guy with a suit and a suit and a book that's reading his book, or a guy that's like, or someone who's like learning like math and who's like learning for the sake of learning, or learning in a big lecture hall. And the second reason it's more likely that social relevance entails this type of thing and more like student outreach, or like more like outreach than like research, is because outreach and stuff affects all students and affects a lot more people than research. OG in their deputy correctly points out that research is, even if you focus on social sorts of research, oftentimes only read by researchers and people who care about that type of research. Whereas when you invest in the student body, or when you invest in the social relevance of your university and of your academic institution, that affects a lot more people, because everyone that engages with that, everyone engages with that version of the university. So then the likely trade-off is between research funding, which is what Opp is defending, and funding these sorts of welfare investments. Why is it bad to spend your money in research? 3 reasons. First, because spending money in research only benefits a few students and a few researchers who have the qualifications to do research. That is, most people who are studying a degree or studying something like don't actually end up doing research and don't have the qualifications to do high-level research that plugs gaps in their field or that is socially beneficial or anything like this. Whereas our side and the things that we're defending affect everyone. Second, because research can be done by the private sector, as I said before, and it's probably better for it to be left for the private sector and not done in universities because of those profit incentives that I was talking about. And because if a university does the same research that private sector is doing, but if the university does it happens to do it before the private sector, that means it's likely the university does it in a worse quality and that the world ends up worse for it because universities have access to fewer economies of scale. That is the same thing I was talking about with more researchers and fewer researchers. Most researchers in most universities only have one specialist in each department or one specialist that specializes in each thing because you only have so much money that you can invest in your school. Whereas most companies have multiple people that are researching the same thing, which means you can get the same sorts of outcomes that both gov teams are talking about, but have them happening a lot better if universities just focus on not doing research and leave the private sector to do the stuff that matters for the world, or that matters for the world. And the third reason why research in universities is bad is because of publish or perish culture. That is, if you're focusing on plugging academic gaps, and if everyone is, if universities and private sector are competing to plug these gaps, then everyone is trying to find the gaps as fast as possible, which means the quality of research gets worse, and each researcher ends up in more stress because they have to spend more time researching. I'll take a POI from closing.
Don't you think, unless the value of research is important, how much money gets spent or how many people are reading isn't necessarily relevant till the point the research indicate bad outcomes?
I don't think I understood your POI, but the next part of my speech will flag a bit of what you were talking about. That is, research is really expensive because it's really speculative and you're not sure, even no matter what type of research you're doing, you're not sure exactly what the results you're going to get are and exactly like how much money you can make from it or how much grant funding you'll get for the research in the future, which means that universities oftentimes lock up a lot of their research or a lot of their money doing these types, a lot of their money doing research and things like that. On our side of the house, all of that money gets freed up and a lot of it gets freed up because universities invest in social research or in social outreach for the stuff that we were doing. We would prefer that it gets invested in social outreach for two reasons. First, because it improves the quality of life of every single student. When you invest in things like better dorms, or when you invest in things like humanities programs, which OO seems to value a lot, and like teachers within these humanities programs who can improve the quality of lectures for every student, that affects every single student and everyone within this institution. And second, because it increases the carrying capacity of the university. That is, if you invest in more dorms, if you invest in more like university apparatuses, that means you can support more students, which means that once they leave university, they can do more research in the private sector and they can make more money for having done it. We give them more options to be more financially secure, and that is good. Thank you. Go for us.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and invite the member of opposition to start the case for CO.
Hello, people. I'm Anshuman, he, him, gender pronouns. I would take a POI in the chat. If any one of you cannot hear me at any point, I have a weaker internet right now, so please let me know and I would stop and I would reconnect. I hope that's good. I will take a POI from OG explicitly. I would start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We would engage with OG, but let me be very clear. If you have a lot of leaders and a lot of sponsorship towards the academia, and academia leads to bad messaging into the society, we think more people now read bad messaging and that worsens the society. There is no reason as to why explicitly more funding going into academia is individually good, unless it leads to good outcomes in the society, and that's something that we would challenge on. But before that, let me just do a bit of rebuttal. We think that at the point when academia starts doing social commentary or is seen as a political spectator or is seen as an authority which would support corporations and politicians, a large group of people are far more likely to discredit individuals who are pushing those kind of social commentaries. Let's say you are pushing a commentary that is beneficial to the Republican Party and that party hired you. I think half of the Democrats would simply boycott your paper, which means more often than not, the popularity of academia as an authoritative field decreases. We think that's extremely bad. My whip would take that up because that's a rebuttal. But we think, just to introduce, that's extremely bad because that means that regardless of how much funding you have, academia loses the value it had in the society, loses the value to influence anyone at any point even in future. We think that's a bad thing, regardless of how much engagement you have. But if academia loses its credibility, more often than not, it anyways would have lesser leaders, because now nobody sees this as a credible understanding. Academia now has no difference from a biased YouTuber making an interview, apart from the data set, which actually makes people much more which actually makes it much more difficult for people to comprehend. That being the response, and I will take it from OG later. Please understand a little bit of characterization. First, academicians do not reach definite conclusions. They have a small research set. They interview a small number of people, and then they reach a conclusion on the basis of the data they collect. Second, if they are funded by corporations or politicians, they are more likely to work on a limited timeline. They have to submit their work faster, restricting them from collecting more data to make things holistic. Third, their chances of getting rehired depends upon their ability, or getting more funding depends upon their ability to produce favorable results for the party or the corporation that hired them. But also, you have about 1,000 papers published every day. That means the paper that gets circulated the most, that is the paper that gets the highest number of clicks and share on social media. The paper that is recommended the most becomes the most popular for leaders. But also, in the OG world, academicians are now considered valid authority on social issue because they are made so popular by corporations and politicians, making their statements socially relevant and can be used to break a deadlock in the social opinion that people have in the society. Our argument is that when academicians do social commentary, specifically on the model that OG proposes, they would rather have an anti-minority commentary for pushing minorities 100 years back from where they are at right now. I think first thing, this is something that Tejas has already covered. That is the existing level of privilege that exists in the academician community is very high. That is, if you are in a middle class, you are trying to get the job so that you are sustain your life. Going into academics takes 5 to 10 years of your life, and you cannot wait for that particular period on a stipend. You are necessarily looking for a quick job in some software company so that you are able to make money out of it, which means only privileged people generally take up academician, because it takes a very long period of time without a lot of funding for them to sustain. Second, they also have limited exposure. Sure, they are going to argue that they would go and talk to black people and collect data. But please understand, when they collect this data, they interpret this data on the basis of the biases that they have built in their mind. So just because they go and talk to black people doesn't mean they would give favorable outcomes about black people. Thirdly, publication bias. Academicians know that at the point when they produce something that is favorable to the majority, it will be read more, and therefore it is much more likely to be published by publishers. Fourth, funding from corporations. Please understand, this is what OG runs upon. Funding from corporations and politicians depends upon these people being able to produce majoritarian data, so that they are being utilized the most possible in the most possible instances. That is, politicians rather have an incentive to win the majoritarian vote, and therefore have an incentive to prop up academicians which are supporting that particular party. But also, corporations want to sell their products to most number of people, and therefore they would always cater to the majority, as we see it. But even if all these mechanisms do not work, please understand, in the age of internet communication, the articles that actually communicate to the bias of the majority are far more likely to be shared, which means the 1,000 articles you have every day, only those are going to be shared that are going to be that are going to cater to the bias of the majority, which means people who are writing are going to write keeping the bias in mind. But also, even if some people are doing minority research, it would not be shared at all. We think this is bad, because now they are a authority on social commentary that they aren't on our side of the house. Even right now, there are some people producing research saying black people generally have a lesser IQ than white, but they are not considered social authorities, and therefore nobody listens to them. But that kind of research will be published and shared more on-site opening government, and therefore people will listen to them. I will take a POI from OG.
Republicans will hire researchers on your side anyway, and they do fucked up research for corporations on your side anyway. When we push that to academia, they do research that sure might be valuable to the majority, but the valuable to the majority doesn't have to mean racism. It can also mean, as OO says, an infrastructure project that helps everyone in India who earns less than $10 a day.
What can be correct is that, to an extent, there will be some research that would be about infrastructure. Please look at our mechanism. Would that research be shared the most on social media? If there are 1,000 papers, or would that research be recommended the most? Understand, if there are 1,000 papers every day, What kind of paper are you going to share the most? Something that is sensationally supports you, not something that talks about an infrastructure project being built because you don't necessarily care about it. But the difference is, on our side of the house, they are never seen as social commentators. Social movements are never going to refer to their statements to break deadlock. Minorities are never going to refer to their statements to break deadlock. Please understand, on your side of the house, their statements or their research is used as a mechanism to break social deadlocks, and therefore they are in a determinative capacity to change social thinking in a manner that is majoritarian for all the incentives that we have given you. And even if you don't believe those, simply look at the sharing mechanism that happens over articles on internet. And we don't think like so many books are published. A lot of articles go on internet and they are read the most because people have direct access and free access to internet, which means just look at the sharing mechanism and see how social commentary would flow through. Currently, people who do academic research on field theory are recognized more. Tomorrow you would have someone publishing that black people have less IQ, and that would be shared the most. And I think that's bad. Very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Just remind speakers to time themselves and invite the government whip to conclude the case for closing Gov.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
You are.
Okay, you sound very excited. Where are my notes? Here we go. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to be very clear about what is and isn't in this debate, because I think it's quite messy in this regard. Firstly, it's unclear to me why perception is in this debate, i.e. I think on either side of the house, people are likely to view research that supports them as verifying them. That is to say, if someone believes that the solution to gentrification is building more houses, if they see an academic publish an article that says that, whether or not academics are like on a mindset of being socially relevant or academically relevant, they're probably going to perceive it as validating to them. So it's unclear to me how CO are comparative at all, right? Because at the point where they say that Republicans already pay, or OG points out, but also they can see that Republicans, like there's already research saying that's kind of racist in some ways. It's unclear to me why someone who's racist isn't going to say this is really useful, and they are going to say it on their side of the house. It's unclear to me how that's comparative at all. Cool. But also in this debate about the vast majority type of research, I don't think it changes. It's unclear to me how it changes, right? Because OGs say that you're more likely to focus on cures for malaria and like nuanced history figures who are like relevant and like solutions to gentrification. How are these not academically relevant as well, right? Because given the fact, presumably the reason why they're socially relevant is because we're unclear about what the solution is. If we're unclear about what the solution is, it means we haven't done enough academic research, and so it's an academic gap, and so filling it in makes sense. So it's also academically relevant, right? I think what the delta is probably like OO are probably closest to correct here, right? Where in status quo, you have like the H1 index, you have these massive incentives to publish as much as you can. And I think the delta that changes is that like on their side of the house, on our side of the house, we're publishing less research of like Neolithic age stuff and more research and like stuff that's actually filling academic gaps in socially relevant areas, right? I want to point out what this means for a lot of opening government first, because I think a lot of the case about public policy, a lot of the case about like legitimizing social movements, a lot of the case about getting more useful research like cures to malaria. I don't think these particularly stand, because I think this type of research is probably going to happen on either side as far as if it is socially relevant. It is first of all profitable anyways, and so private companies are going to do it, or like NGOs or non-profits are like slightly funded by the state who care about these sorts of issues, etc. They're probably going to do it anyways. Unclear to me why this is super important, but also it is just also academically relevant. It's going to happen regardless of whose side of your house you fall on. Cool. OO then really quickly, because they have a case that technically exists independent of this. So basically say you get less funding for certain humanities, right? I want to point out I don't want to say important humanities, but yes, the important humanities that make a difference to people's lives, like women and gender studies, issues about minority rights. I think they're likely going to exist on both sides of the house insofar as they are still academically relevant and socially relevant, right? They also still have social use. It's probably socially useful to understand women's reproductive health. It's probably socially useful to understand how certain like vaccine programs weren't effective for black people and were effective for white people, etc. Right? I think these things are socially useful. I think there is demand for this research from the state, and so they can fund nonprofits to do it. It's unclear to me why it's particularly better. Note, nonprofits also have the concentration of similar people with similar minds who like have this complex understanding, right? Because the people who work for these nonprofits obviously care about it and have done a lot of research and studying in this previously, and so obviously you have the same amount of concentration of these people, so their unique mechanisms for universities better don't actually stand. But I am happy to bite the trade-off that there will be some less funding for some university like departments, right? I'm going to say I don't care, right? Because they say there's a principal harm, but their principal harm is the most circular thing I've ever heard, right? Because they say universities should do research in these fields, and therefore if they don't do research in these fields, it's a principal harm. Why is it a principal harm? Oh, because they should do research in these fields. That's like not analysis. It's not a principle. I don't actually care. They don't tell me why it's bad if like you have less funding for like random Neolithic Bronze Age historians, right? I actually am not sure why this is super important in this debate. They do say you get more unemployment. I want to point out, first of all, it's obviously incredibly marginal as far as the amount of people who are doing this research on either side of the house probably isn't particularly large. But second of all, I want to point out, there's like also relatively symmetric. I think there's less demand for these people on their side of the house as well. So you see like business buildings and universities just have more funding because oftentimes these universities get more money from this anyways. So you already have a higher degree of funding for these sorts of things. Unclear to me why it's super harmful on their side of the house. But finally, I want to point out, presumably this policy takes place slowly. It's not like overnight you have this massive change in like culture within these universities. And so they just stop caring about that type of research. I think presumably it happens slowly. So these people do have time to adapt. And also there's a finite number of jobs anyway. So if you increase the amount of jobs in one field, these people might be unemployed, but then whoever takes up those jobs like vacates another job. And so you do have like the same amount of jobs. Unclear to me how this is super important or harmful. Cool. That's OO broadly out of this debate, I think. Why do we beat OG? And yeah, I think CO also have a debate as far as the case is just non-comparative. Cool. I want to be very clearly, right? I think the vast majority of research that everyone talks about, except for like OO, when they talk about like really niche Neolithic stuff, probably happens anyways, as far as private companies have the incentive to do this, right? I want to add a new mechanism for this because you're allowed to add mechanism per the new Euros manual, which is specifically that the type of people who want to do research in this stuff change on our side of the house as well, right? That is to say, if it is the case that universities like are doing all this stuff and like they're moving towards social relevance, I think people who want to do academic relevance can work for private academic institutions, specifically like NGOs, NGOs, nonprofits, or like Pfizer or whatever, right? If they want to research in these specific things in an academic way. And note, oftentimes these companies have an incentive to give these people a large degree of leeway, insofar as oftentimes these like researchers have a high degree of competency. And so in order to invite them and entice them, say, we'll give you some leeway where you can do research on some things that you want, but you also have to do this profitable research that we care about. You probably still get same amount of research on either side of the house, right? What we do get differently is community outreach, and I want to weigh very explicitly against Tejas because he has analysis for this as well, but it's slightly different. His analysis is specifically that you get community outreach through the mechanism of like research, right? I want to point out this is still academically relevant, right? If you want to fill in a gap in research about how UBI affects certain communities, you have to give people UBI. If you want to see how a certain abuse model works, you have to give it to them as well. So this is still academically relevant, and they never actually tell us why these people are like so elitist that they can't conceptualize as an academic, like it's an academic gap to understand how a certain minority group reacts. So you probably are able to get that on both sides of the house. Really quickly before I finish my weighing.
Yeah, firstly, maybe women's rights or indigenous people's rights are important in abstract, but when it comes in contentions with states' utility, that is when trade-off exists on your end. But why would private sectors also prioritize profit incentive?
It's not just private sector, also like nonprofits and NGOs and like organizations that are fundamentally meant to do this. Like one of the largest researchers for women's reproductive health is Planned Parenthood, which is not an academic institution, but they still do it, right? It's unclear to me why you have to do this in academia, i.e. universities. Cool. What are our impacts then? First of all, we get better life for students on the ground. Second of all, we get better community interactions within the university, right? So I think a lot of universities are often community centers, and our side of the house, because they're spending less money funding like a bunch of academic research, you have more money to like subsidize other people entering your campus and like spending time in your community centers. Oftentimes universities have gyms. Oftentimes universities are like tourist sites, making it cheaper for the people of your own country and city to be able to interact with. I think that's a net positive. Thirdly, we get access to like better workshops and seminars and stuff. I think oftentimes universities have the capacity to help working companies around them become like more like enticing and inclusive and stuff. I think they have the capacity to do that for a cheaper price on our side of the house because they have to spend less money on that. But finally, I think you also get more political capital funding in universities, which I think is a better mechanism than what OG say, because OG say, well, you have like some like social relevance. The problem is you get social relevance backlash because some people disagree. We just say become more invited to the community supports you more. That's how you get more funding for universities. I'm kind of be proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and invite the opposition whip to conclude the case for closing Opp.
Yeah, just 15 seconds. All right. I hope I am visible and audible.
You are.
Okay, then I'll be beginning on the reverse count of 3, 2, 1. All right, I think we've got, first of all, a short summary of what our case looks like before I move on to our responses to OG and then our responses to CG. I think the difference in this debate is that on our side of the house, people produce an academic paper, they get an award, they're focused on this academic research. On OG, if somebody publishes a social commentary supported by data, they get an award. But this is something that will change the social narrative completely. We now see those very same academicians in a different light, and they're now called to TV programs on social debates, and they're used as authority or credibility by parties to talk about minorities in a bad light. No, that this is very likely given the mechanization and the characterization we get from OG when they tell us that, look, academia is isolated, it is conservative, it is biased. We do not get why it is very likely that suddenly upon you forcing them to interact with the rest of society, all of these conservative aspects and all of these biases will go away. In fact, what we tell you on our side of the house is going to happen on their side of the house is that instead, when you're forcing them to interact with stuff of social relevance, the ideas that they will propagate will be those against the ideas of these pro-social aims, or those against the ideas of liberal views which are uplifting of these minorities. These are the ideas that will then be supported by data and used to actively condemn these vulnerable minorities by political parties in order to further their own objectives. And I think currently this does not happen because the academic community totally rejects social commentary and views it as unethical and biased, which is not something they are willing to indulge in. I think this narrative is something that completely changes on the other side of the house when suddenly the academic community is likely to accept all of this and is likely to move into the ideas of the social commentary. I think then the difference again is that anybody who does social commentary right now is seen as a bad author, and therefore any of the ideas that can be used to sort of incur negative impact upon vulnerable minority groups is something that simply doesn't get popularity because social commentary is rejected. On OG, they would be celebrated and their ideas would be something that is actively used to sort of reduce the quality in society. I think then in response to OG, we get three arguments. First of all, on the advancement of pro-social aims. I think we already counted this right now when we've already told you that as per their very own characterization about how academia is isolated and academia is biased, we do not get why it is particularly likely that academia will use its position when it is now interacting with society more and when it is now focusing on topics of social relevance, why it will use this as a means of furthering the liberal ideas that their entire case is dependent on. I think now that we've proven to you that it is a lot more likely that these academia who are already biased against maybe certain groups or who are already part of conservative parts of society due to their isolationism are likely to then use this platform in regards to social relevance to actually further ideas that will be counterproductive for the upliftment of these vulnerable groups. I think on that level, we're able to take down the very idea of the advancement of pro-social aims. In fact, we're able to tell you that this is flipped and the opposite of this is going to happen, wherein groups that might have been experiencing progress and process over the past decades and centuries will now be undoing all of that because academia, which has credibility, is suddenly going to be actively fighting against them because they've been forced to do so behind the pursuit of social relevance. I think then secondly, they bring up this idea of how they're the principal good. I think we've got three responses to this. Firstly, that we don't get why it is the role of academia to pursue principal good at the point when there's already the existence of stuff like corporations doing this independently or governments having the obligation to do this. I think people who move into academia are doing so because they want to indulge themselves in personal research behind ideas that they're actually interested in. And we do not get enough mechanization as to why it is the role of academia to do so. But even if that's not true, even if it is the role of academia, why is this principle good likely to occur when the social messaging is directly counterproductive for the ideas of the minorities, which means that any principles that are going to be impacted here will more likely look like there being decreased equality in society and there being greater disparity between the minorities and the majorities. But then also thirdly, I think that this principle good is still better on our side of the house because you still get this politically neutral publication from academia. If there's some coverage of philosophy, say on, I don't know, moral relativism, then that is something that will be used on both sides of the spectrum, both liberal and conservative ideas, to further whatever political ideology that they're pursuing. This is something that, since it is neutral, will be used by liberal parts of society to propagate ideas about how minorities deserve rights and how vulnerable groups deserve to be treated equally. I think this is comparative to what we get from this government side in general, because on their side of the house, this is then messaging that is likely to be actively negative of these rebel ideas and actively negative of these vulnerable minority groups. And on a comparative, at least we are not directly incurring any harm, but also in the future, I think we're likely to incur much more benefit at the point where I think academia over time is becoming increasingly liberal as a result of, say, social change that occurs generally in society and academia wanting to curb to a limited amount of social change. So I think over a certain amount of time, you will still get academia to contribute positively to somewhat of a degree. I think if you force that change, or in case in the status quo, academia suddenly starts focusing on social sort of relevance, it's likely to immediately focus on these conservative ideas that will be negative for the rights of minorities and will be negative for social change in the first place. So I think we're able to then flip the idea on how principal good will occur. And then I think thirdly and finally on how they argue it's better for academia, I think we're going to take this down on two levels. Firstly, that this is only going to be better for academia on the presumption that this funding is still going to continue flowing. I think at the point when we tell you that the only funding they'll get is from government institutes who are expecting academia to perfectly focus on exactly what the government wants to propagate, you're going to have totally biased academia. That is the outcome. So even in case you're able to concede to how funding will occur, I think it's still likely that these harms will still exist in regards to academia will become extremely biased. But even if this is not true, I think we're still going to revert to our extension as to how academia's credibility goes away, and the trust that is placed in society, the trust that is placed in academia by society goes away at the point where it is highly politicized, and there's a very significant amount of backlash that it undergoes as a result of society actively condemning it, as a result of it suddenly becoming a socially relevant issue. I think we're going to take a POI from OG then.
CO is divorced from reality. Academics get canceled by left-wing professors for racist IQ scholarship and lose tenure if their quantified social impact is bad. Racist parties employ racist pseudoscience on either side of the debate. The only relevant impact is on creating real public policy research with the ability to uplift the very minorities you talk.
All right. Yeah, I got it. I think in case the idea then is that you're still going to have some condemnation of these ideas in the first place, and there's still going to be some condemnation of the biases that come from these sources of academia in the first place. I think this is still something that is predicated on very few number of cases. In a majority of cases, in case you are pushing academia to the forefront via the mechanization that you give us. And let's move on to CG then, when they tell us that their entire case was on the idea of how outreach programs exist and how there'll still be a lot of interaction between academia and the rest of society that causes academia to be more respected and academia to be something that people interact with on a more active basis. Even if there is still condemnation for academia, I think this goes in line with the argumentation we give you as to how academia's credibility goes away. But even if that's not true, even if the credibility still remains to a certain limited degree, I think we're still able to tell you that this majority of cases, even if there is backlash, there's still likely to be a very significant propagation of these conservative ideas that will be directly negative for these vulnerable groups. So even if there's backlash, I don't think this will totally cancel out the impact that we give you, which are very negative for these vulnerable groups. I think then responding to CG, they only bring us one real extension in this debate, which is entirely derivative of what OG talks about in regards to outreach. And I think that we're able to tell you then that outreach is going to be worse in this debate. We're very, very proud.
Arnav, we are over time. Stop.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech and invite everyone, and everyone who was an interesting debate, and invite everyone to leave. I'll call you back in about 15 minutes. Be cool.